most people, at least in this country, have heard at some point, if you don't have anything good to say, don't say anything at all. It sounds
Mhm.
really nice, and oftentimes it is, except to the hurting person. It can sound really close to the silence, the stepping back, the not saying anything. That silence could be interpreted as you must only have bad things to say.
Right.
And so you're choosing to not say anything at all, which means the lack of acknowledgement of the hurt, the lack of helping with the hurt is just as synonymous with you're part of the hurting group. It may
Right.
not be overtly seen or done, but we have to acknowledge we have to have a different response that's overtly reassuring. I'm not the threat that you fear I am.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. Today, I'm delighted to tell you that we are back again with our friend Lambers Fisher, who was on our earlier podcast, talking to us about diversity. And we'd like to continue that conversation today. Lambers, how are you today?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for having me, Randy and Greg.
That's great. Greg, you had some specific ideas that you wanted to run by Lambers as far as the continuation of our conversation.
Yeah, at the end of our last conversation about this diversity, you were talking about this idea of creating safety by drawing boundaries, but it can still be about love. And so much of that is how we work with couples when there's been betrayal. So how do you navigate this issue of racial diversity? And really, it's very applicable because there are those who would say there has been a betrayal. So their recovery, their healing of the relationship would look one way. There are others who say there may have been not going to own it, and their journey may look different. And then there may be those that says there has been no betrayal. So how do you navigate that with maybe individuals and specific circumstances you might be working in, but then also in a greater global cultural context?
Sure. No, that's a very common challenge and a reasonable one, just because I always assume misunderstanding, fault, and disrespect. And oftentimes by doing so, it's helped me to see where people are coming from. On the surface, there has been no betrayal. Sounds very insensitive. Sounds like there's clearly a feeling there, clearly an emotion there. And for you to deny it is intentional disrespect and disregard for that person. And the other person who's feeling that is feeling disrespected, feeling disregard. How can you deny my experience? But that person is coming from a place of experience. They've experienced certain things, said things, heard things, done to them, or witnessed, whatever the case may be. But the person saying it often hasn't had that experience. Maybe something they've heard about, but if they haven't personally experienced it, personally witnessed it, or known someone who has, that's just as good as watching it on a movie. And then once the movie goes off, you say, well, that's not real. Good thing that isn't happening in real life. And so when that person expresses that, that's not callous disregard. It's not part of their life, their daily experience. And so part of that challenge is bringing people closer together so that they can see real people having real experiences. And a lot of times that's what's happened over the past year with the things that have been publicized on the news and shown around the world. A lot of awareness has been coming because I actually heard people come in to the counseling session. They've never received counseling before. They say, this is so new to me. There's a Band-Aid ripped off and I didn't even know there was a scab. I thought that was either ended years ago, long before I was born. I thought that was just skewed things. And now I saw something that I experienced that's tragic in a way. I have to learn how to process what I'm going to do about it. But just the fact that this is real. And so we have to acknowledge the reality of that. And so when you're seeing other people, it's a good reminder to say other people might be experiencing things that are outside of my realm of reality. Before I deny it, let me consider whether they're talking about something that's a real experience that I may not have. And then the challenge is, what's my responsibility to do about it? I may not be responsible for what happened, but can I be a part of the solution? Because a lot of times people say, well, I'm just going to stay off to the side and not be a part of it. It's not my fault. So it's not my responsibility. But I'm also acknowledging that I'm not experiencing it as much as they are. So I'm going to stay off and let them fight their own battles. But the challenge with that is oftentimes we were raised with, and I say we as in most people, at least in this country, have heard at some point, if you don't have anything good to say, don't say anything at all. It sounds really nice. And oftentimes it is, except to the hurting person. it can sound really close to the silence, the stepping back, the not saying anything. That silence could be interpreted as you must only have bad things to say.
Right.
And so you're choosing to not say anything at all, which means the lack of acknowledgement of the hurt, the lack of helping with the hurt is just as synonymous with you're part of the hurting group. It may
Right.
not be overtly seen or done, but we have to acknowledge we have to have a different response that's overtly reassuring. I'm not the threat that you fear. I am.
Yeah. It's interesting how silence at best can be interpreted as apathy, but it
At
can
best.
also be interpreted as opposition.
Exactly.
And like you said, we have messages about saying something, or, so many of the men that come to our workshop, one of the family rules that they dealt with was minimizing.
Yeah.
Well, culturally, we can have that same family rule or societal rule where we minimize stuff, and we minimize it in an attempt to create safety or avoid having to deal with it.
Exactly.
And I do think some of what we've been exposed to over the last year has made it really difficult to continue to minimize it. But then we're left with, what is the response? How do I engage this issue? And one of the things that I'm hearing you say is, anytime you're approaching the issue of racial diversity, there is a personal component and there is a corporate component. And if I try to combine those two, then I'm not going to be effective. I have to separate those two and get clarity. What is my personal experience with this? And how do I want to respond to that? And then what is my cultural contribution, the group that I'm a part of? How are we contributing to this? And, it is difficult to navigate those two things when they seem so separate. I haven't done anything personally that is offensive. So it's difficult for me to own that I might be in a culture or a society that has done something offensive.
Exactly. It's often a challenge with that association with groups. I view that, as an extended family member does something that is considered offensive, does something wrong, maybe even illegal. You don't disown the family member. You acknowledge that's my family, but that's not me either. That's my behavior. Don't associate me with that behavior. But you can understand I'm not going to disown that person either. It's a difficult challenge. We do that with, say, sports teams, or say like a sorority or fraternity. Somebody you pledge a sorority or fraternity, you commit so much, invest so much of your time, energy into it for all good reasons. I'm not even talking about the skewed reason, for community service and career things. And then 10 years down the road, after you've been wearing those Greek letters for years, that somebody at a school you never gone to, in a state you've never been in, does something and brings national spotlight in a negative way. You have a choice. You can say, that's not who I am, but that's being associated with me, and people are going to see anybody wearing those letters is going to be associated with that behavior, and rip the letters off of your shirts and your lapel and everything else and disassociate with them. Or you can say, that's not what we stand for. This is an exception. And I'm going to be a part of speaking out against the behavior, not to cancel them or our group, but to say, I want to bring some positive experiences to help address what happened, reduce the negative, and increase the positive. And sometimes, is that my responsibility? Is that my burden? Maybe not my fault, but I have a vested interest in the outcome. And so just like in a relationship sense, at the very beginning, we acknowledge baggage. We talk about in relationships. Mm-hmm. And so I was, we work with a couple, and the guy will say, well, she's treating me as if I did this and as if I did that. I never did any of those things. But she had an experience with the last 5 guys before you that she learned she couldn't trust any man. And you're lucky you even have a chance to be in a relationship at all. But can you acknowledge that when she sees you as a person, but you look like the last person that hurt her just because you are a man. I don't care what facial expression you're like. The last 5 men who hurt me, and you are a man. So it's not your fault. You didn't cause it. You didn't earn it. But you can say, I see your hurt. It matters to me that you feel better, so I will do my best to help create new experiences. Right. I technically have to do more work than I should have. Right. I have to do more work than I have earned, but you're worth that work. Yeah. It changes the whole conversation. If we can do that culturally, to say, right. People who look like me have done certain things. I didn't. I know that. But I want to help you have create a safe experience, a healing experience every day, in a one interaction at a time. I want to help make a better positive experience. Then that will change the whole conversation. If people experience it that way, then the whole thing can change.
Yeah. I've been thinking kind of the history of some racial issues in our country is it's kind of like this marriage that happened 40 years ago, but the origin of the marriage was it was a forced marriage, and it was an abusive marriage, and it was a
Nice.
controlled marriage,
Right.
and it was about power. And so 40 years later, we're still married. And I'm not admitting the way our relationship began. I'm not owning that I misused you and that I forced you into something. And anytime you try to bring it up, I say, well, I don't do that anymore.
Exactly.
And there's a denial of the chaos of the origin. And
Yeah.
if we can't, and we see this in couples work, if there was chaos around the origin of the relationship, it doesn't matter how many years they get away from that. If that's not acknowledged, if there's not healing that's brought to that, then it continues to inform the relationship. And in that case, silence is offensive.
Exactly.
If the spouse isn't willing to talk about how the relationship began in some sort of chaotic way, my silence is offensive because I'm not naming and identifying your reality and experience. And so there is a complexity that, on one hand, I can say, well, I don't do that anymore, or I'm not responsible for that, or whatever that language can be. But I love what you said. One of the best things I can do is say, in a relationship, I hear that you bring pain into our experience. What can I do to support you and help you so that you can be safe?
Yes, yes, and that's where the ampersand that
Mhm.
is core to the faithful and true kind of model is so important, because a lot of times people have to feel like they have to choose. Am I that negative historical experience, or am I who I'm trying to be today? And the answer is both.
Mhm.
You can acknowledge a negative history, part that preceded you and part that you were born into or grew into, or even early direct experiences, and have new experiences now. You don't have to deny one part of yourself. It's actually even more impressive to acknowledge a difficult, tainted past, because it puts more distance to say, I'm not just that kind of guy. No, I learned to be, I grew to be, I chose to be, and I'm continually working on it one day at a time, trying to figure out new ways to be even better. I'm not even taking myself for granted, let alone you. And if we offer that
Mhm.
as a gift to the other person, I know I'm not perfect, but contrary to some other people around me, I can acknowledge it, and I'm trying to get a little bit better every day. That's better than, you know what? That's not an issue for me. I'm good. I never did anything
Right.
bad. That's almost more offensive. Like, oh, you think you're perfect. You think you know everything. To acknowledge imperfection can be, and a desire to grow can be even more reassuring to the people who you're interacting with.
Yeah. We had a speaker on a while back, and we were talking about this idea of self-awareness, and that we can't fully know ourselves outside of community. It's Dan Allender's idea of needing others to see our face. And what's true is I can't fully know how I respond to racial circumstances, relationship situations, unless I'm willing to listen to how other people are experiencing me. It's,
Exactly.
it's not enough for me just to say, well, I don't think I do that, or I didn't intend that, or that wasn't my meaning. But I actually need others to say, this is how I'm experiencing you. And then again, that openness and that humility to see what in that can I learn about myself? What do I need to become aware of and be attentive to in my own journey and experience?
Exactly.
One of the things that's true, and I'm very thankful for this, is the nature of the work that we do. There is some diversity in it. And we do have men come and couples come from various backgrounds. And one of the things that I'm aware of is there are certain um, cultures, and many times it has to do with recent immigrants. But what can happen is there becomes shame around the fact that they are a minority culture or a different culture, because as children, they're aware that they're outside of the primary culture. And I often kind of use it as a litmus test. Were you ever embarrassed about your parents because of who they were culturally? Now,
God.
every teenager is embarrassed about their parents. That's just a rite of passage.
Sure.
But there's a unique aspect where I'm embarrassed by my parents because they sound different, or they cook different food, or we look different. Well, there's a shame that comes from that diversity that can be imposed by a primary culture that values one culture over another. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
It makes sense. And I have a personal aversion to extremes. You can have extreme on the positive side and extreme on the negative side. You can have extreme on the negative side that looks like self-shame based on, parental shame and difference. And because I see them as different, I must be different. And so I lower myself unnecessarily. And then there's extreme on the other side. You know what? You think I'm less than. Matter of fact, you're less than. You think you're better than me. Matter of fact, is not only are you incorrect, we're better than you. As if in order to overcome being seen as less than, we shoot to be above someone else. And we justify it, or whoever the we is, people in that extreme justify it because it's in response to, well, you don't want us to be lower than, so you have to justify this. But it's not the desire for self-esteem and to avoid shame that's the challenge there. It's the extreme, not to be too low, not to be too high. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. That's not a challenge to lower yourself. That's where's the ought.
Yeah,
where's the healthy in between? Avoid the extremes and have a healthy self-esteem. Have a healthy view of yourself and for others. See your strengths and other strengths. See your growth areas and other growth areas. Then you have two people. Then the fight isn't necessarily for equality as in sameness, but as equal value. Now, what are we going to do with it? That is the challenge, and it starts at home. That's why I love the relationship piece of it. It starts with modeling, having parents and siblings who and extended family who can model. You're great. You are a child of God. You're a child of everybody else in this household and his family. But you also have stuff to learn too. There's other value there, and if we can do that, then we can extend it when we meet other people, and we can extend what we started in our own home.
We talk a lot about comparison-based identity, and that in our survivor strategies, we try to find our value and identity in how we compare to other people. And I don't want to expect too much because I'll be disappointed. I don't want to expect too little because then I want as much as I can get. So I'm constantly scrambling to see where I fit in the hierarchy. Well, that just because we do that as individuals, we can also do that as cultures and communities, where instead of finding our value in truth, we find it in how we compare to others. And like you've identified, I can put myself at the bottom of the stratification and live in some shame, or I can put myself higher in the stratification, believing something grandiose about myself, versus giving myself the truth, which is that equality piece in value and identity that comes from God. Exactly. And anytime we're trying to find our value or determining somebody else's value and by comparing them, one of the things that we can know is we are no longer in the truth of who God has created us to be.
Nicely put. And it's an ongoing challenge. It isn't a once and for all thing. We're going to experience triumphs. We're going to experience disappointments. And it's something we continually need to remind ourselves of. And the more practice we get in doing it, the more likely we'll be able to be an asset to somebody else and encourage them, whether they're a family member or a coworker or a client, whatever service we're providing in any help and professional field. We can offer that as a continued gift, and we be helping edify and lift each other up one day at a time, and especially cross-culturally.
Well, I mentioned at the beginning of our first podcast that this is an area of passion and expertise, this idea of navigating cultural diversity. So what are the messages? What are the lessons? What are the truths that you want to communicate when you're specifically teaching around this area?
Well, there's a couple principles that kind of level the whole playing field for me. And they all hover around the reality that a lot of times I see people who genuinely want to help but don't know how, or even disqualify themselves because they feel like they have to be perfect. They don't know enough to help out. I fear that I'll do more harm by trying, so I don't do anything at all, that type of thing. And there's a few principles that kind of level the playing field for me. First is the need to accept the inevitability of offense. As we talked about the last time, there's so many different things that are offensive, and they're so personalized, and they change over time. Something that was okay 20 years ago wasn't okay 10 years ago. What was okay 10 years ago is all of a sudden offensive now. So things change. So we have to accept the inevitability of offense. No matter what you do, no matter how good you get at it, you cannot guarantee that you will never offend anybody. But
and I want to go back even to that first story that you told. What is offensive to this person isn't offensive to this person.
Exactly.
And until I know your story and what is offensive to you, again, like you said, I'm guaranteed that if I try, at some point, I will be offensive.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's where people who know me to be usually the most optimistic person in the room. I get really realistic real quick because that sounds really pessimistic. It sounds really discouraging, and yet that only takes the absolute out of it. That 100%. If I'll mess up at all, I might as well stop. You can, was the second principle comes in, make intentional efforts to significantly reduce the amount of offenses that occur with increasing your cultural awareness, increasing your awareness of the history, the present, the concerns, the experiences. That way you can know, oh, I see this one. I'll make my own mistakes. I don't want to make that mistake again. Thank you for helping me see that, understand that. What things have you experienced in a different way? And even if it's a matter of, oh, say that you prefer me to say this phrase, and then somebody else prefers you not to fight the argument. Well, so-and-so said it was okay. Well, that's okay for them. Can you personalize and be flexible? You can make intentional efforts to learn more and be flexible as the situation arises. So you can reduce them. You can't eliminate all offenses, but you can significantly reduce them. And then the third one is for those few that remain, since you reduce the amount of offenses, those few offenses that still happen, you can make intentional efforts to repair them. So it means you can accept, you can reduce, and then you can repair those those offenses by acknowledging them, seeing that you hurt somebody, giving it credibility as opposed to minimizing it. Own your part, no more, no less, and then make intentional efforts to create healthier experiences in the future. Because people might hear you say something and be ready to write you off. And then realize that, wait a minute, you don't do what usually comes afterwards. You said the phrase, that's the offensive phrase. I know to be leaving, but you're doing something different. Let's see how this goes. Maybe you don't mean what I think you mean when you say that phrase, what everybody else means when they say that phrase. And so we get back to meaning. And so we can accept the inevitability of offense, reduce them as much as possible, and then learn strategies to repair. That's kind of where my training is focused on, not judgment and shame, but of encouraging and empowering, and then giving practical strategies to help people do that, and not only in their professional helping efforts, but in their personal life as well, because you'll never know everything about everybody, but you don't need to know everything about everybody in order to have a positive impact on somebody.
And what is the role of asking questions, asking permission, asking what language do you use, or how should I respond to this? Or, it's so interesting because it can be offensive that I don't ask questions, or it can be offensive that I have to ask questions. That I'm not culturally aware, And so back to that original point that you just got to risk that you're going to be offensive. But there has to be a hope that there's life and hope beyond the offense.
There definitely is.
That if I have to be defined by the offense, or I have to be trapped in the offense, or held hostage by the offense, that doesn't feel very hopeful. But what is hopeful is I can offend. And this is also understanding, and we talked about this idea, the difference between intentionality and unintentional. So this is the assumption that it's an unintentional offense, and I stumbled into something that I didn't mean to, and now we can find our way through. It becomes much more complex, and this is back to our relational or our couples issue. When I'm making choices to intentionally hurt my spouse, I'm making choices to offend my spouse, and I really don't have a desire to change because I'm minimizing them, or I think my spouse is catastrophizing them and making too big a deal of it. Until I begin to recognize the significance of my choices, I'm not going to be open to changing my choices.
Yes, very nicely put. I mean, as relates to the intentional efforts of offense, then that actually takes most of the different conversations out of it and focuses on, so do you actually really want to be in a relationship? Because if a interdependent, a mutual relationship, because either you're saying, I want to be in a relationship where this is totally, and you're ready to you takes it, which is not the definition of a healthy relationship. It's like, if it's intentional between one of those.
Lambers, the video froze just for a moment. Could you repeat that last point?
So we have intentional offenses that you chance person relationship is for them. Because if you're looking for a interdependent mutual relationship, then either you accept the reality that you'll need to learn to take what you dish out, to take as much abuse as you're offering in a mutual relationship, or own the fact that you want an unequal relationship where you want a victim, not a partner. You want somebody to take your abuse, but not. Either way it goes, neither of those are the definition of a long-term healthy relationship. And you can understand why the other person isn't interested in signing on for that long term. But the challenge then isn't about misunderstandings or clarification of care because you're choosing to not care in a different way. But oftentimes, either people aren't ready to realize that's what they're doing, or realizing it, and then you can just focus on that. But it changes the conversation. To the point you made before that about asking, I definitely encourage asking, because that's the only way you'll learn, one way. But I do acknowledge that it depends on how you do it. Not like there's some script per se, but there's this mindset where there's a certain understanding and acceptance that there's the asking and then there's the receiving. And sometimes if people receive a negative response from their asking, that's like, whoa, I was just trying to understand. It was just a reasonable question. And it very well may have been a reasonable question. But if the other person is hearing that reasonable question for the 50th time, then their response might be different. Or if they heard it for the 6th time, for the 4th time, not just the number, but the last few times they answered the question, the answer got thrown back in their face. They gave a gift of an answer and then it was stomped on and smushed or used against them, then that might influence their reaction. So to a certain degree, there is intentional effort to consider that the response may not be what you hope. But the only way you'll ever learn is to ask. You can ask directly, or you can ask on your own with your own research. And so find a way to give a gift in your asking, not a monetary gift, but a gift of consideration, a gift of acknowledgement. Hey, if you mind me asking, feel free not to answer, but I want to ask this, because you're giving them permission to say thanks, but I can't answer that any more times, because you're giving them permission. Or I'll answer that, but I'm going to show you, thank you for giving me that understanding. I appreciate that. I'll put that into practice, and let your actions show it afterwards, because that gives them fuel to risk answering another question in the future. And last, I'll say this: sometimes people feel burdened to teach everything. You know what? I always wanted to learn about people like you. Teach me everything there is to know, which is a burden. It's ask. I don't know everything about people like me. Which people like me are we talking about? Yeah. African American, Christian, this age, whatever the case may be. And so it's a burden, as opposed to coming in and say, this is what I know so far. This is what I've heard so far. Please fill in any blanks you're open to, because I want to understand you better. And if you want to correct something that doesn't fit with you, feel free to do that as well. It's like, I'm coming to not say, give me 100%. I got about 30. You don't have to teach me from scratch. That's my gift. I'm showing what I know, and I'm open and I'm flexible. So just ask. There's ways we can do it tactfully. Always getting it right or wrong is not the goal. That's an extreme. But know that we can still increase the likelihood of getting a positive response. And even you accepting a no increases a no, thank you. Thank you for asking, but I just can't. In a healthy way. Oh, I understand. I appreciate that. Thanks for even considering it. I'll find out someplace else. Increases the likelihood you might be able to get a chance to get a yes the next time in a different circumstance, because you accepted my no. So if I'm in a better place, I see that you might be able to be trusted with a yes, with some information next time. So how we do it isn't about fault, subservience. If you will bestow upon me your wisdom and your knowledge about your culture. No. It's just mutual gifts, and we can give when we're asking to receive. And these are some of the things we can learn to practice over time that can help in any environment, and it can change the relationship, save a relationship.
You know, one thing, we've come to an end, but one thing that we've not talked about that you alluded to, so we'll probably need to schedule another one, is the issue of power and racial diversity and cultural diversity, because you kind of at times were talking about how if the person who has power is not responding, that's very different than mutuality. And we have to own that there are institutions, there are individuals that have power, and how they steward that power is a significant part of the conversation.
Indeed.
The other thing that I would say in closing is, then my assumption is someone's going to be listening to our 2 podcasts and will be offended. And that's okay.
And that's okay. Indeed.
Lambers, we can't thank you enough. It has been a gift to us that you've spent this time with us today, and we really appreciate that. Our listeners, I'm sure, are going to be compelled to want to hear more, and I know that you have some free webinars available, that type of thing. How can people find you to have access to such content?
Yes, I'm easily findable. People can go to my website, which is diversitymadesimple.com. So it's pretty much the title of my common webinars that come out. And whether it be individuals, professionals, or groups, whether it be an online webinar, I have a free webinar that just gives an overview of these principles and some of the offerings that I do, as well as having me come out and say, well, hey, that's a good summary, but I need you to talk to my team. I need you to talk to my leaders. We need a jump start. We've had diversity trainings, but they've always been offensive or fearful or angry. This is a positive side of things. This is a relationship building side. Can we do that? And feel free to reach out, and I'll be happy to help whatever I can.
Now, that's fantastic news for all of us. That's for sure. Thanks again for joining us today. And for our listeners and viewers, thank you very much for joining us. Lambers Fisher has been our special guest today again, and we hope that his wisdom and experience has been a benefit to you. We hope that you will join us again on our next podcast. Visit faithfulandtrue.com for many more resources. There's over 350 free downloadable podcasts. We've got blogs. We have an online bookstore. There's just many resources available to you. We hope that you'll view our new Faithful and True channel on YouTube. Subscribe and click the like button. We'd appreciate that. And until we join you again next week, we hope that this coming week for you is going to be a week that's filled with many blessings and great vision.